Greeks had only wooden boats for island trading. Today they have the biggest merchant navy in the world. In the 1890s, they began to buy rusty old British tramp steamers. They crewed them with sons and nephews, worked them hard, and made money. Soon, tiny island communities spawned dozens of millionaires. Onnasis was obsessed with the desire to be a ship owner.
Onnasis was a practical man, and he knew that if he wanted to be in the shipping business, he had to learn. And he was not ashamed of learning. Up until his death, he wanted to learn.
London was and is the most important shipping centre in the world. For hundreds of years, much of the city's wealth has come from brokering, chartering, shipping, and shipping insurance. Onnasis had already made enough money to maintain a permanent suite at the Savoy. But now he was about to start all over again. He worked grueling hours in a small backroom shipping office. He learned how to risk his money in a risky business, one where almost daily freight rates soar and plunge on the trading floor of the Baltic Exchange.
I'm a Greek ship owner, and my father was a Greek ship owner. And you have to know, it's just like poker, when to get out and when to go in. And, shipping is a tremendously gambling thing. It's timing. You cannot be afraid to lose. If you're afraid to lose, you can't make money because the ship gets old.
Onnasis was ambitious and never lacked nerve.
Funny enough, all these ship owners are aggressive like that. But not too aggressive, because the too aggressive people make one or two good decisions and then they go broke.
In the years of depression, he was told that there were a couple of ships laid up and he could buy them for a song at the time. Of course, nobody knew what he was going to do with the ships. And I suspect that he did not know either. So he risked his money, he bought the ships.
10 Canadian cargo ships were going cheap. Onnasis bargained hard, paid cash, and bought 6 with his own money. With world shipping in the doldrums, he was taking a serious risk. But he had timed it right. The world depression eased, and before long he was getting a handsome return on his investment. The proud young shipowner could well afford a state cabin on the liner Augustus, bound from Buenos Aires to Genoa. On board, he noticed an attractive older woman. She was a sophisticated divorcee called Ingeborg Dedichen. Before long, a shipboard romance blossomed. In all his serious love affairs, Onnasis was attracted to strong, independent women. Throughout the 30s, he and Inge traveled everywhere together. The wealthy daughter of a Scandinavian shipping magnate, she opened doors for him. In 1938, a Swedish shipyard launched the Ariston. She was the first ship Onnasis had built.
Well, Onnasis was a man who could foresee a lot of things, and he was always looking ahead of his times. He was the first one who started building larger and larger tankers because he believed that the larger the tanker is, the more economical it is.
Ariston means best in Greek. At 15,000 tons, she was also the biggest tanker afloat. Onnasis, who saw that oil was the fuel of the future, ordered 2 more like her. The Ariston's maiden voyage was cause for celebration. A party of friends joined the ship. She was the first tanker to have a swimming pool. But the Second World War caught Onnasis by surprise. In April 1940, an invasion fleet sailed from Germany. the Nazi war machine rolled over Denmark and Norway. Anxious to avoid the same fate, Sweden declared itself neutral and impounded the ships of combatant nations. Onnasis' 3 new ships were moored in Swedish docks for the rest of the war. Onnasis may not have had a good war, but he had a good time. In Hollywood and New York, he mixed pleasure with business. He relaxed with Stavros Niarchos, a fellow self-made Greek millionaire, who shared his love of ships and women. Onnasis said, "I approach every woman as a potential mistress."
If you walked into a room and you didn't know who he was, you'd still pay attention to him. And I noticed that, because a lot of people look like Onnasis in Greece. Half the population looks like Onnasis. He was short, ugly, but he had far more presence than a lot of far better looking men than I've met. He wasn't awed by women, and of course he was extremely generous. And the moment a woman would express any desire, he'd say, "Well, you can have it," like that. So it was easy, and I mean, he got, after all, some pretty famous women. And he knew how to handle them very well, and flatter them. He was a great flatterer.
Onnasis did not want a movie star for a wife, but a Greek girl from a good family. Tina and Eugenie Livanos were the daughters of a great shipping magnate and highly marriageable.
I don't say that he married Tina because she was a girl of a rich family. But it's very interesting to notice that the marriage of 2 fortunes makes a bigger fortune.
He was 40 when he married Tina. By way of a dowry, his father-in-law gave him a ship. But Onnasis had earned his place at the top table. Despite German U-boats, he made money in the war. A ship chartered to the Allies earned $250,000 a year. 450 Greek merchant ships took part in the war. 360 were sunk. Only Onnasis never lost a ship or a sailor. But would his luck hold when the war was over?
It wasn't as easy to make money after World War II as people suppose. The reason why a lot of people made money was because they took tremendous chances, because they knew they were visionaries. They knew that America had to rebuild the world. How do you rebuild the world? Not by train, but by ship.
At the end of the war, non-US citizens were forbidden to buy American Liberty ships. But with a clever lawyer and a dummy corporation, Onnasis snapped up 16 Liberty ships and 4 surplus tankers. In the winter fuel crisis of 1947, his ready-made fleet made big money.
Well, of course, Onnasis was not a saint. Onnasis would look into the deals, find out whether there are loopholes, take his chances and go ahead. But he would never violate the law. He would be at the brink of the law. He will perform the law in his own way.
In the shipyards of post-war Germany, Onnasis saw his chance for a bigger and even bolder gamble.
Well, then he visited Germany and he saw that it was wiped out. Nothing was there, and he asked them whether they could build for him some ships, in particular tankers. And they said that they cannot because they lacked finances. But if they had a contract for about 30 ships, then they would go to the banks and get the money and build the yard and then build the ships. And this is exactly what he did. And he signed a contract for 30, if I remember correctly, 30 ships, 30 tankers.
He started building tankers, which were called in those days monster tankers, which were about 46,000 tons, which today is a handy size.
Festtag im Hamburger Hafen. 50.000 Menschen kamen zu den Howaldswerken und sahen den Stapellauf des größten Tankers der Welt, der Tina Onnasis.
He named this monster tanker after his wife. His daughter Christina broke the champagne, and his son Alexander pressed the button that sent her down the slipway.
Die Taufe des stählernen Giganten. Dann kam der große
His supertanker's tonnage broke records, and the way Onnasis financed them broke new ground too.
He went to an oil company first and secured a contract for, let's say, 5 years. He then went and ordered a ship. The only thing he didn't bother to tell the oil company was that he didn't have the ship ready.
Banks would not lend much money at the time for shipping and tankers and so forth. And he convinced them, after much persuasion, that the proper thing to do was to finance not the ship, but the contract.
Stavros Niarchos was becoming his great rival. Every time Onnasis added a giant tanker to his fleet, Niarchos would go one better, with an even bigger ship.
She's a 47,000-ton oil tanker christened Spyros Niarchos, after the 8-month-old son of Mr. Styros Niarchos, the Greek controller of the greatest ever tanker fleet.
The World Grandeur is a 39,000-ton capacity tanker, and with 2 more like it, which are launched later, it increases the fleet of the Hellene Magnet to 29 ships.
Named the Evgenia Niarchos, the turbine-driven tanker, over 47,000 tons deadweight, is the sister ship of the Spyros Niarchos, still the world's largest single-purpose oil tanker.
Ironically, Stavros Niarchos had married Tina's sister, Eugenie, so the great rivals were brothers-in-law.
Onnasis and Niarchos did have a rivalry, and it was a normal one. They were both the 2 biggest ship owners among the Greeks. They both had about the same amount of ships and the same amount of wealth. There was a certain competition there, of course there was, and there was a rivalry, and maybe even there was some animosity. In fact, there was.
In 1953, Onnasis set up home in the south of France, where he leased an elegant chateau. Here, he and Tina enjoyed the good life. By now, Onnasis had bought up much of Monte Carlo. Olympic Maritime's headquarters were in an office over the casino. Tax-free Monaco made sense to a man whose ships had been among the first to fly flags of convenience from Panama and Liberia. From his office, Onnasis could look down on the harbor, where his newly finished $2.5 million yacht lay at anchor.
That's his yacht, Christina, down in the harbor. It was a Canadian frigate before Mr. Onnasis converted it into somewhere to live. It flies a Liberian flag, although Mr. Onnasis has never been there.
He loved the yacht. He considered that it was his private house. He loved it so much that you could see him sometimes walking and having his hand on the balustrade and caressing the varnish and everything else. You could see that when he was doing it.
Lapper's egg is the bottom of a swimming pool when lowered. It's a dance floor when raised. The staircase with marble balustrades goes round and round inside the funnel. Conditions are good on Mr. Onnasis' yacht.
The ship had a lot of very unusual things. One was that every cabin was named after a Greek island and had a map of that island on the door in gold, about like a quarter of an inch thick in gold.
On board the yacht, the bathrooms are in marbles of many colors. Some have taps that are gilded dolphins. Mr. Onnasis has made a fortune of anywhere between 100 and 200 million pounds.
The soft white leather that sheathed the bar stools came in fact from the foreskins of sperm whales. Commercial whaling was an indispensable source of hard cash for the Onnasis empire.
Onnasis was a person who was single-minded in getting what he wanted, and he saw that the restrictions on whaling imposed by the International Whaling Commission would prevent him making as much money as he wanted, so he just went outside the law altogether. Onnasis had absolute disregard for any kind of rule. The whales that he took were any kind that came in front of his boats. If they were whales that were supposed to be protected because they were smaller than the legal minimum size, it made no difference. For example, when he was whaling off the coast of Peru, it was worked out that something like 96% of the sperm whales he took were undersized.
This terrible damage to whale stocks did not concern Onnasis. He once said, "The rules are, there are no rules." To evade quotas, he registered his whale catchers in Panama, which had not signed the whaling treaty.
I went down and went into the office in Monte Carlo. Then he said, "Now, tell me, what do the British people really think about me, the top people in the oil business and these sort of things?" And I said, "You really want to know, Mr. Onnasis?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Well, I'll tell you." He said, "1 minute. Nigel, you are my guest in Monte Carlo. I don't want you to be embarrassed. First of all, I'll tell you what they think about me." So I said, "Well, that'll be a big relief, Mr. Onnasis. Yes, you tell me." He said, "They think I'm a Greek shit with too much money, don't they?" And roared with laughter. And I said, "You're absolutely right."
He had a luxury yacht, a fleet of tankers, and enormous wealth. And yet he remained at heart the refugee from Smyrna. Even on his yacht, Onnasis never stopped thinking about the next deal.
Many times at the end of a day or at the end of a party or a nice dinner or whatever, when everybody else was gone to bed, and he was putting on a coat, he was going at the stern of the Christina, taking a whiskey, and sitting alone there thinking for maybe 2 or 3 hours by himself, just thinking about his business, I presume, and his plans.
In 1953, Onnasis devised a plan so audacious that it threatened to turn the multinational oil industry on its head.
He found out that he was in conflict with the policy of the oil companies, the major oil companies, the Seven Sisters, because they would build their own ships and they would only charter independent carriers from time to time. As he wrote once in a letter, he felt like a taxi driver who saw that all his customers would buy their own cars. So he wanted a piece of the cake.
Ever since the Americans struck oil in Saudi Arabia, Aramco, the great consortium of American petroleum companies, controlled everything from drilling to refining. Onnasis took an offer to the new and inexperienced king. He asked the king to let him ship an ever-increasing share of Saudi crude. In return, he promised to build a fleet of oil tankers, flying the Saudi flag. The Jeddah deal would have enabled him to dictate world freight rates for oil.
Had the deal of Jeddah been successful for Onnasis, he would have become the richest man in the world. Because there was no limit for his profits, because he would get more and more percentages from the Saudi Arabian government. It was actually a threat to the other governments and a threat to the other ship owners.
There was a secret meeting in London after the news leaked out. Onnasis' great rival, Stavros Niarchos, had hired someone to scuttle the Jeddah deal. The man he met at Claridge's hotel was a high-level fixer and troubleshooter. This is the first time that Robert Aimé Mayhew has told his full story on television.
They detested each other. There's no doubt that the personal element was what enhanced the enthusiasm to kill, but it was survival. No, he truly felt threatened from a business point of view. The first thing you know, if you allow this to continue, there is no market for any competitor.
As a former FBI agent, Mayhew was able to place a bug on Onnasis because he convinced the intelligence community that the Jeddah deal was a threat to US national security.
It just happened that a week before I was hired by Niarchos, CIA had placed me on a monthly retainer to handle sensitive assignments for them. As a consequence, now we really had a built-in ally. They made their communication system available to me throughout the world. And we made life for Mr. Onnasis more difficult.
To put it mildly.
To put it mildly.
Mayhew activated his political contacts in Washington. He started at the top.
What happened is that we were able to have an appointment with the Vice President of the United States. Mr. Nixon was Vice President at the time, and he immediately recognized that this is something that should be immediately presented to the National Security Council. After thanking him, and on the way out, he said, if you have to kill this son of a bitch, don't do it on American shores.
Mayhew struck his next blow at a shipyard in Germany.
Well, the first supertanker that was being built specifically for this deal was at Hamburg, and it was to be named after the king, the then king. And we realized that we could never stop the agreement if that first shipment was allowed to take place. And as a consequence, in a fight for time, we managed to organize a strike at the shipyard in Hamburg.
So you organized? Who organized it?
I did through some of my operators, and also with the help of CIA.
Despite everything, Onnasis finished his ship. He even invited American oil executives to attend her launch. Onnasis knew that if they refused his invitation, it would be an insult to the Saudi king, after whom the ship was named. Mayhew devised a new means of attack.
We felt quite sure that his financial structure was very, very weak, and that if we could cause him a major problem, that his whole house of cards would collapse. We knew that his fleet had the experience of fishing in illegal waters off Peru. As a consequence, we made arrangements with the Peruvian government to seize his fleet.
They sent out ships, they sent out an aircraft which actually bombed around the factory ship. They certainly strafed it with machine gun fire, and they forced the boat back into harbour with the catchers. And the Peruvians were very nasty about it. They said, you're going to pay a huge fine, we want $3 million to let you go again.
And the night that happened, we had a big banquet thinking that we now had killed the monster. Much to our amazement, we soon learned that he had this whole thing booked with Lloyd's of London, if you please, including his potential profit.
He got $15 million in insurance money and $30,000 a day for all the time that he was out of the whaling operation. I mean, he just made an enormous amount of money out of it. So he was just laughing all the way to the bank.
He came out richer than before without having to work as hard.
In the end, a Swiss court ruled in favor of the big oil companies. Onnasis had to back off the Jeddah deal. By then, big oil had almost brought him to his knees.
The American oil companies they're no angels. They're far more unscrupulous than any Greek ship, whatever it was. They went after him. Why would they allow Onnasis to make all the profits with the Arabs when they were doing it themselves? They had ships too, and they were afraid that Onnasis might up the freights of his ships when they were carrying their oil, which was coming to them.
Well, they all gang together in a concerted effort to frustrate the deal, politically, financially, and otherwise. First of all, they would not charter the ships. The Onnasis fleet was boycotted. Secondly, they would look into the charter parties which were in existence for loopholes in order to frustrate and jeopardize the deal. And also by protesting to the Saudi government and doing a big fuss.
So this was a very bad situation for Onnasis and his fleet, because suddenly he was obliged to lay up the highest number of his fleet.
As his rivals snapped up the charter contracts he had lost, Onnasis began talking to his bankers. Then help came from an unexpected quarter.
Riding a new crest of popularity is President Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt's clever, ambitious strongman. In Suez, he has created a crisis and an emotional weapon to stir the passions of 23 million Egyptians.
Gamal Abdel Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal, the vital waterway for the world's oil tankers. Believing their national interests were at stake, Britain and France went to war. Cairo fell swiftly. Egypt's army was defeated, but the West paid a price. Sunken ships blocked the canal, so Middle Eastern oil had to travel round the Cape twice as far. Twice as many oil tankers were now needed. Only one man had a fleet of ships with not enough to do, and he was Aristotelis Onnasis.
When the Suez Canal closed down, we had a 65,000-ton tanker which made one trip from Persian Gulf to UK or Northern Europe and earned $6.5 million.
It had only cost $4 million to build the ship. Freight rates shot up more than 1,000%, and within 6 months, he was $80 million richer. In business terms, he never looked back. He knew how to weather the storms of economic boom and bust. His fleet made money when there were wars in the Middle East and rode out the oil embargoes of the 70s. To the very end, he was never to lose his flair for business. Outwardly, his family life seemed ideal. His wife Tina was a celebrated society beauty. Christian Dior made dolls' clothes for his daughter Christina. She and her brother Alexander had everything they wanted, except for one thing: the company of their father.
As with many rich people, for every present you get, your father's away for another 2 days.
As for his mother of his children, he loved her, but she was unfit to be Onnasis' wife. Tina was too busy with herself than with her family. She never had the time for her children. She was frivolous. She was a butterfly.
His relationship with Tina was rather hard to work out. By some standards, you could say that was a happy marriage.
There was, however, another woman. Maria Callas was the most famous diva in the world.
And the pulling power of this one woman on this stage definitely fascinated him. Well, first of all, he devised the idea, obviously, of saying to his wife, let's invite the Callas and her husband, Meneghini, on the Christina, because she tried to resist going. And the husband sort of said, well, you do need a break. and that seduced her into it.
Onnasis never has been connected with art because you know that he had some very bad experience about the collecting paintings. Therefore, collecting some people like Callas, it was much more important than having some paintings of good masters.
Onnasis had always cultivated the company of celebrities, like Sir Winston Churchill. But Maria Callas was something different.
He was definitely drawn by La Callas, but the person he seduced was Maria, the woman. Then what did she see in Onnasis? Well, when Greek meets Greek, boomph, you know.
It was a bit too much. I mean, he brought the mistress right on the boat, which is par for a Greek marriage. Didn't shock me at all. It didn't shock my father. And my father did it all his life, that. But my mother wasn't Tina. Tina took umbrage and she left.
Onnasis and Callas, the two most famous Greeks in the world, were for a time the two most famous lovers in the world. Tina's second husband was Sonny Blandford, the future Duke of Marlborough. Then, after her sister died, she became the fourth, Mrs. Stavros Niarchos. Legal difficulties prevented Callas getting a divorce. When they were removed, Onnasis seemed delighted.
So I said, we were kidding. He said, well, you have become a signorina now. I said, you won't be signora, you'll be signorina. So that took care of the whole problem.
Though she was finally free to marry, Onnasis kept her waiting in the wings.
They had an argument, some sort of silly argument, and she left and went back to Paris. Well, I don't know about a woman scorned, but a man walked out on, turned the tables on her, and he sets his eyes on a form of revenge, really, in wooing Mrs. Kennedy.
This concern to manage always to be with a lady who added something to him, perhaps is the only humility he has had in his life.
When he invited her to Scorpius, rumors began to fly, and paparazzi began to swarm.
It was just a rumor, and it wasn't anything close to news. But we knew that Jackie and Ted Kennedy were invited on Onnasis' yacht at Scorpios, and that a bouzouki group with a friend of mine, a singer called Yannis Poulopoulos, was invited to entertain the guests at the time. So I thought I would force my way into the group, pretend to be a guitar player, which I wasn't, put a Minox camera behind the chords of the guitar and hope to a scoop. Well, Jackie loved the party. I mean, she was ecstatic with the music. So when the music started to play and the people started to sing, she got up and she wanted to dance. And she attempted to throw a plate on the floor, and she picked the most expensive dinner plate. Onnasis grabbed it in midair, called Onnasis, who was in charge of entertainment, said, "Bring the cheap plates out, Onnasis." And she kept breaking plates all night long. It was about 4 o'clock in the morning and Jackie was long gone. Onnasis had been drinking with the group and singing songs with the group. And then he looked at his watch and he said, "Fellows, I'll have to say goodnight. Gotta go down and take care of my wife." And that was the exact quote that I was expecting from him, because I knew from his friends that he was referring to Jackie as his wife and the whole thing had been arranged. He saw in him a guy who knew how to enjoy life, how to spend his money really for that purpose. Onnasis was, as I said, bigger than life. He was a contemporary Zorba the Greek. So it wasn't difficult to love him, and it wasn't difficult for Jackie to fall in love with the idea that she would be Mrs. Onnasis.
The proposal of Mr. A.S. Onnasis...
Marrying the widow of a democratic president put Onnasis under the spotlight. He was working on a massive deal with the military junta, which had imposed fascism on Greece. Ever since Smyrna, he'd been cynical about all governments and had no patience with political questions from the press.
What the hell that has to do with what we are doing here? Will you tell me? Now, don't start this because I'm going.
I think ever since he married Jackie, everything turned bad for him. The Greeks are very superstitious people, and a lot of them said she was the Black Widow, and I thought it was rather unfair, but I'm very superstitious myself. I certainly wouldn't want to have been in Onnasis' shoes.
Cracks began to show in the marriage. Onnasis was horrified by Jackie's extravagance. She was spending more than her monthly allowance of $30,000 on clothes. Preparing the ground for a possible divorce, he actually leaked her shopping bills to an investigative reporter. It was a perfect marriage, joked his children. He loves names, and Jackie loves money. He was a loving father, but a domineering one, who broke up Christina's first imprudent marriage. He disapproved of Alexander's love affair with an older woman. But despite this, father and son were growing closer.
He was adoring Alexander. He was not loving Alexander. He was adoring Alexander, but in his own way.
What brought them together was flying. Onnasis owned Olympic Airways. He was the only private individual to own a national carrier. He called it his hobby, but to Alexander, flying was a vocation.
Alexander was a brilliant young man, and I don't have any hesitation to say that he was born to be a pilot. He was flying amphibian aeroplanes, jets, and helicopters as well.
Alexander was scheduled to check out a new pilot on a January afternoon in 1973. The plane had just been serviced, and he was not to know that the aileron connecting cables had somehow been reversed. On takeoff, the pilot tried to turn left. The harder he tried, the more violently the plane banked to the right.
Alexander was very badly injured in his head. Only his heart was working. His brain was not functioning. This was proved right from the first day. Of course, we advised his father, also his mother.
And they said, is he going to live? And they said, yes, he'll live, but he won't think or be able to speak again, probably. And Daddy said, I won't have anything of it. I won't have anything of it. He must die.
He was in oxygen for 24 hours. And then Onnasis gave his consent to cut the oxygen.
It was days before Onnasis could bring himself to bury his son. They brought Alexander to the little chapel on Scorpius. Onnasis often came here. He was frequently seen sitting by his son's grave for 3 and 4 hours at a time.
Could you tell me, sir, how you feel at this about this?
Well, like any other human being, I'm not anything special or exceptional. Like any father would feel. He's a nice boy. He was a promising boy and a good boy.
Aristotle had died after his son had died, period. I mean, he was a living corpse, so I would say.
Back up with him, Paul.
It was really, I think, the biggest shock that he had during his lifetime.
It upset him very much. And, of course, later on, this awful disease, I don't know what it was that he had. And I was sitting at lunch with him one day at Claridge's, and he said, oh, Nigel, you've noticed my eyes, I think. And apparently he had to sort of stick his eyelids up to keep them open.
Onnasis knew he was dying when he entered hospital in Paris. His disease, myasthenia gravis, was incurable. While Jackie visited frequently, his daughter Christina hardly left his side. Jackie was with her own children in New York on March the 15th, 1975, the night he died. He had not wanted to come to the hospital. His wife and daughter had to persuade him. It was almost as if he had wished to die. His body was flown home to Greece. It was on a long flight some months earlier that he had written his will. In it, he left half his estate to his daughter Christina. Jackie's inheritance was limited by a prenuptial agreement. She was eventually to get $26 million. Christina had always loved her father too much and never found a man to replace him. After 4 marriages and many failed relationships, her heart weakened by diet pills, she died, aged 37. Onnasis' funeral cortege passed through the little fishing village of Glyfada. The coffin had been made from one of the walnut trees that grew on his island. For the second time in this story, a flotilla of small boats crosses the water to Skorpios. Before he died, he established the Alexander Onnasis Foundation in memory of his son. Each year, it distributes millions of dollars to charity, medical research, the arts, and good causes. And so the Onnasis name lives on. For unlike other reputations, business fame rarely lasts long. In the Greek Orthodox religion, only saints can be buried inside a church. But Onnasis found a way round that. Annexes have been built on each side of the chapel, and today they enclose the tombs of his son, his daughter, and himself. The Christina was donated to the Greek government, but for years she has been left to rust in a naval dockyard. There are not many people left, it seems, who can afford a yacht that burns 30 tons of oil a day.